as Henry Flint has explained, the music assumed what he calls a structural artificiality, unlike anything in the past. So this artificiality of the structure, this is the artificiality that made it so homeless amid the conventions of music, and it assured that Cage's model, its legacy, would function at a conceptual level rather than a purely musical one. Three foundational texts that define the period 1959 to 61 as a threshold of a new frame of reference are George Brecht's 1959... Oh, next slide, sorry. Oh, next one. Oh my God. So this is... I may as well tell you what this is. Yeah. Okay, actually, do you mind going back? I just want to tell them on each slide. So this is a slide of the thing that you can see outside, water walk. And in fact, the slide I showed you before, basically these are the do-it-yourself scores. So you have the squiggly lines and then straight lines and then a grid, and you put in the dots, and you put it all together, and you have your variables, so you kind of plot out the score yourself. So that allowed, then he did this score, which is also coming out of indeterminacy. So it allowed you to kind of incorporate all these things. What's fascinating is this is very theatrical, right? So, and it happens just a moment before Fluxus is invented. And, you know, I mean, I used to think still it was his students, and I'm not sure, but they were all, and George Brecht was in his class. But then George Brecht does a piece called Drip Music. And, you know, he has a piece called with Vase of Flowers. So all of these elements in Cage end up, I mean, many of them in some of the first Fluxus scores, which is also fascinating. Next slide, please. So this is his class. Dick Higgins in the middle, George Brecht up the top, Jackson Maclow, Brecht, Alan Capro, and Al Hansen. This page is also outside. This is a page of George Brecht's notebook in the first day of class. So he's writing that, you know, John Cage is speaking. It's June 24, 58. And this is very nice. Obviously, Cage mentioned the story about the anechoic chamber on the first day of class. So you've got this little note by Brecht at the bottom that says, one time Cage thought there was a difference between sound and silence. Then he went into the anechoic chamber, heard the high note and the low note, and realised there's no such thing as silence. So he'd obviously told him that. And the way, what Cage is doing there is splitting up the sound into a field, right? So all the variables he kind of breaks down structurally. As everyone says about Cage, and it's something really important to keep in mind, structure was crucial to him, right? If you let go of everything else, if you don't have structure, it you know, goes into the ether. So structure was the one thing he had. That 433 is the quintessence of that structure being kept. Next slide. So this is Alan Capro. That's Brecht's timetable music. And this is Alan Capro's attempt to do a score in Cage's class, which basically had this like knife in a breadboard making sounds. They're all these little experiments. Brecht did, he first wrote his scores called music, and then he changed the word to event. So he changed this to timetable event a couple of years later. But the idea was he got the whole Cage class, new schools downtown in New York, he got the whole class to leave and go up to Penn Station, the railway station, and grab a timetable. And if your timetable said 8:15, then 8 minutes and 15 seconds is when you have to sit at the railway station and watch everything that happens, and all of that is your event in your time frame. So it's like a ready-made score, the timetable. So next slide. So yeah, so this is this idea about the last version of 433 with the verbal score. Next. Yeah. Okay, we'll stop you for a minute. I thought I should also, I'm going to start talking rather than reading because it gets very boring if I read all of it, so I'm going to switch to talking in a moment. You might be relieved to know. So, three foundational texts. By the way, am I going too fast? Am I speaking too fast for you to understand? Okay. So the three foundational texts, what I'm calling texts, define the period 1959 to 61 as the threshold of a new frame of reference. So they're George Brecht's 1959 timetable music, which is the first ever short form score that will become huge in the next few years in Fluxus and everything else, and I think anticipates conceptual art. Lamont Young's 1960 compositions 1960, and Henry Flint's concept art. In fact, the fact that these works were not all generated from the standpoint of art, but were conceptual interventions from very different disciplinary perspectives, only makes the broad implications of Cage's example more decisive. It matters greatly that Brecht was the only practicing artist out of the three, that Young was a musician and composer, and Flint was a mathematician, musician, philosopher and mathematician. Their distinct positions have had various effects on the reception of each of these three texts, respectively. But together, they can be read as a kind of proof of the impact of Cage. So this is Yoko Ono was married to a composer called Toshi Ishiyanagi at this time, and she gave out her loft for performances. So this is just, and Ishiyanagi was in the Cage class as well from time to time. So the following year, 61, 60 and 61, no, 60. 60 is when they first get written, and the next year is how he adapts them. So Lamont Young wrote a series of scores. The first series, Compositions 1960, and then when he wrote those, he was based in San Francisco, and after pursuing a graduate degree in music at Berkeley, he then had been to Darmstadt in 1959, which was the epicenter of new music, to take a summer course in composition with Karl-Heinz Stockhausen. It was there that Lamont Young learned about Cage's chance compositions. Having only previously been aware of his indeterminate scores, this was that's all he knew. So he knew the indeterminate scores, he didn't have the full scope of Cage's project. So this was a turning point in Young's development, and this is what inspired his 1960 scores. The Compositions 1960 were these short textual scores. Actually, if we can just go back for 1 second. So they're these things in the middle. So they're these short textual scores, or word pieces, as Lamont Young called them, involving visual, if not theatrical, elements. Composition 1960 number 2, for example, instructed the performer to build a fire on stage, and specifically not to sit in between the fire and the audience, so it would be seen as well as heard. Yeah, they're very beautiful. So this is, there's a linear one, a graphic notation. It says to be held for a long time. And this is the very famous one. It's hard to read, I guess. But this is draw a straight line and follow it. It's dedicated to Robert Morris. So in October 1960, a few months after he had composed the first compositions, Young moved to New York. We can swap it. Next slide. And this was around the time that he became his friends and peers, Robert Morris, Simone Forti and Walter de Maria, Terry Jennings and others, all relocated from the West Coast to the East Coast. And it initiated a lively circle of new composing and performing activity. Young's appearance on the New York scene has been described as giving everything an added momentum. So she said, Barbara Haskell, who's been writing about this, said, it gave a momentum to the activities of Brecht and other members of Cage's class. So I'm quoting her because I don't want to be biased towards Brecht, okay? Because I'm giving that judgment to someone else. But so, because there's all these debates about who created what first, Lamont Young or George Brecht. But in this view, Brecht had already done it, and Lamont sort of stirred the situation up. So while Henry Flint has noted just as aptly that because of the number of scores in this series, which Young had generated and introduced very quickly, they crystallised the new genre. So he performed his compositions at concerts at Harvard University in April on Henry Flint's invitation. He was a student there. And then in New York in May of '61. The New York performance was part of a now famous concert series that Young organised at the Chambers Street Loft in Lower Manhattan of the poet-artist Yoko Ono. On the occasion of the 1961 performances, Young expanded the conceptual basis of the score as a linguistic proposition. So he's written 1961 all the way down. I'm just wondering if I'll get to that. Have a look at that and I'll explain what that's about in a second. So Young, his move was to expand the score. Brecht had converted the idea of music. This time he converted it to the word event, as I mentioned. And then both